Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm actually, if I always think if we weren't such Americans, I wouldn't have to use the mic, which is to say, if y'all didn't spread out like that, if you were more the huggy ass types, we'd have you all down here, because it's kind of weird up there. Can the people in the back hear me? Doubtful. Yeah? It travels like that? Okay. This, I think, might be more useful. First of all, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I wanted to thank the university for having me. Of course, all the folks who made this event possible. You'd be amazed. It's just an hour-long gig, and yet a ton of people have to do a ridiculous amount of logistical nonsense to make sure this happens above and beyond their pay grade. Yeah? And I appreciate all that invisible work which makes these events transpire. And again, I wanted to thank all of you who made some time to be here. Yeah? I wonder if there's, how many people are not from Georgia Tech community? You raise your hand. And y'all came and sat up front. Yeah, I feel like students are more traumatized. I think after like one semester, they're just like, I must hide. It's almost like some sort of atavistic impulse. Okay, well thank you guys for coming. Where are you guys, the people who are outside the campus, where y'all from? Say again, ma'am? Oh, you're, oh, okay, yeah. This Atlanta, okay. Yeah, I think you're playing hooky on your kids, man. You cut them, all right. Well, it's nice you all be here. And then for the students who are actually here, how many of you did their teachers make them come? Come on, man. Just one? Some of you are lying, yo, but it's all right. I don't actually believe a whole number of you, but it's okay. I mean, I do this shit to my students all the time. You know, for real, man, for real, for real. Especially I teach at MIT. So the culture of these schools is very, very similar. Yeah, they're very consummate. And you know how it is, man, at a place like Georgia Tech and a place like MIT, if I don't force my students to go see art, my students will not have time to see art. Yeah? And so I've got to often use all manners of suasion to make this shit happen. So for some of you who are forced to come, I do the same crap. Especially my poor MIT students who they'll take a creative writing class just as a break from materials or as a break from aeronautics, and I will do just dumb shit like, if you don't go see this sculpture, I will fail you. Fucking line out the door. So, all right. So whether you came voluntarily or you came under some form of duress, we will make this happen. Okay, it's an hour in and out. Just by way of introduction, simply I'm Junot. I'm an artist, I'm a writer. We're going to break this up into two simple sections. Yeah, one will be a reading, and the second one will be a Q&A. Yesterday I was at Spelman. Yeah, some of us were there. Yeah. There was the wonderful conference honoring Octavia Butler's work. How many of you have read Octavia Butler? Raise your hand. Come on, man. Get with it. Octavia Butler is absolutely my favorite writer, period. Yeah, and I think perhaps the most important writer of the African diaspora. Yeah. So someone really well worth reading. And if you need a starter, see, most people on the start are like Kindred. I don't think Kindred is the starter book. If I have to say what's the starter book for, what would you say?
Wild Seed for me.
Wild Seed?
Yeah.
See, if you needed a gateway drug to Octavia Butler, the one that's worked for me nonstop is Dawn.
Yeah. Okay.
Because Dawn, if you want to read an incredible book, read Dawn. Dawn will mess you up for life. Yeah. Anyway, so I say this by way of explaining, or at least attempting to hint at the range of my interests as an artist, as someone who's very much committed to community work. So whatever you wish to speak about on our Q&A, I will be happy to participate in that. Okay? So that's that. Q&A, reading. We good? You all right, guys? All right. Anybody from New Jersey? What are you guys doing here? Cedar Ridge? What's up? Where did you grow up? Oh my God, you grow up right up the road. Huh. That was the only restaurant I knew before I got to college, right around the corner from that served rattlesnake. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That's great. What year did you graduate from that? Yeah, so you were a baby. Yeah. Clearly we didn't know each other. You might have known my little brother, Paul. Paul Diaz, yeah. He went on to be like a Marine combat veteran, so he was thuggery light. Yeah. Okay. That's cool. Where else in New Jersey folks from? Where? I know Morris County. Where? Yeah, of course, man. I used to be a pool table delivery person. So I know all these little fucked up towns. Cool. There was another hand. Madam? Oh, are you? Oh, congrats. What department? You guys got the weirdest department. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Where in Essex? Oh yeah, South Orange. My childhood friend, when he totally messed up his SAT, his parents locked him up in your town. He still fucked him up and ended up at Rutgers with me. Yeah. All right, great. So let's do it. Questions, reading. We'll sort of reverse custom a little bit, and let's do some questions first. You guys seem a little like TV is on, so let's do this. Madame.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to know, I asked you yesterday about Kamal Brathwaite.
Yes.
I wanted to talk more about that and the impact of nation language on your narration, and how you felt like bold enough to do that when it's kind of like most writers of color are writing like in a standardized dialect in the narration and, switching up in a dialogue.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. The question of Kamal Brathwaite, a writer, poet. Really, I mean, in many ways, I always think of him as one of the great, Caribbean sort of theorists. Yeah. But the reason this question brings up a lot for me as an artist and for me as a writer has to do, and even for me as a Dominican, has to do with the position that the Caribbean plays. A lot of times, the national project, and by I mean the national projects, the sort of local nationalism, sometimes tends to overpower people's identities, tends to get them away from these larger regional identities. For example, that you can meet folks from various of the kind of colonial linguistic branches in the Caribbean, say people from the Spanish language Caribbean and people from the English language Caribbean, and sometimes the nationalism will get the best of them, and they won't actually see the kind of area identity which exists. But I grew up in a very Caribbean environment, which is to say that I grew up with a lot of Caribbean influences and a lot of different Caribbean communities. Santo Domingo was super excellent for that, because we had a lot of English language Caribbean people who had been living in the Dominican Republic for close to a century, but had maintained a lot of their culture and a lot of their language. Yeah. On top of that, we had a ton of immigrants from places like St. Thomas. Strange, you come to think of it, That changed in the last 30 or 40 years. Tons of folks from Haiti, students from all over. And I grew up in the middle of La Capital in Santo Domingo and grew up in the midst of all these influences. So I kind of had not only an organic sensibility of understanding that the Caribbean was as much my identity as the Dominican Republic. And in fact, as a Caribbean, I shared much more in common with, say, Jamaica than I shared with Mexico. I mean, that's like a tough sort of claim, because I think, especially in the Spanish language Caribbean, there's been this sort of, this mandate that we have to fetishize the language in ways that I think sometimes disrupt the other connections. But I've always been a part of that argument that folks from as old as Sager to George Lamming to Brathwaite, that the Caribbean is an absolute unique area, topos, history.
and that the commonalities, of course, are far stronger than any of the kind of the colonial projects would allow us to think otherwise. Brathwaite was had a huge impact and a huge influence on me when I first began to write. I am continually in dialogue with him. Sycorax, in some ways, is my mother. Yeah. And as far as what is possible and what's permissible, I don't think anything I've done is in any way too radical or even an outlier. So many people in our literary communities have been doing so much more radical things for many more years that I feel that one just is taking part in this larger conversation. And certainly the dialectical projects that people have, the dialectic projects that people have, it had a big impact on me, you know. But again, guys, if you're an artist and you want to be big, you've already entered into a very strange contradiction. Because chances are that what you really want to be is an entertainer. Yeah? Because the nature of being an artist is that what you're up to, at least in my conceptualization of it, has very little to do with approval. In other words, in my mind, I thought I was just writing for people, Dominicans who knew New Jersey. And so therefore I never felt that impetus to write big or to write general. You know, I always felt like, God, who the fuck's gonna read about Jersey Dominicans? And once you absolve yourself of the need to be all things for all people, to be an entertainer, to be big, I think that you can produce all sorts of interesting projects, whether they more or less are keeping in line with what's going on in your community or they're outliers. You know, I just think that taking off the table the desire to be an artist, to somehow famous or somehow wealthy, it moves you away from approval and moves you towards discovery in important ways. Thank you. Something from the back. No, further back. I always love people look back so they don't get implicated, right? Yeah. You guys know I teach at MIT, right? I can fucking outweight you. So, whenever you guys are ready, I'm good, you know. Give me one. And this is the moment I always think, remember you guys. Remember this. It's very important. It's very important. Because most of you are students, right? It's easy to forget, you guys, what Margaret Fuller reminds us about being a student. That there's only one prerequisite to education, and yet it's almost the hardest one to practice, which is you must be willing at any given time to communicate the contents of your mind. And I think that we often forget this in our educational process. I mean, the educational process is so ridiculously sensorial, it's so ridiculously punitive, it's so ridiculously alienating that it doesn't take more than a few semesters to rob us of the desire to be really educated, which requires just that kind of default setting of being willing to, at any given moment, communicate the contents of your mind. I think most of us don't do it because of whether it's lethargy, whether it's experience, or whether it's the fact that, like, in such an uninviting academic culture, why would one? And I do think it's got nothing to do with me or this hour. I do think it's really advisable that, especially those of you who are first or second year students, try to increase the musculature around that. Because you don't want to end up like me. I went to my undergraduate at Rutgers, yeah, state school boy, and I spent my 4 years being the dude who never communicated the contents of their mind. And therefore, my entire undergraduate, look at it, I got a degree, but I didn't get an education. Because it's impossible to get an education unless you're willing to, like, put your shit out. So, give it a hand to them. I'll take that question. it's someone else's function to decide whether something's good or not. That has nothing to do with you. How in the world can you account for my reaction? You think you can. We have magical thinking, which thinks that like, if I do X, Y, and Z, if I sacrifice X, Y, and Z, the volcano god will respond propitiously. And I just don't think it tends to work that way. I think that it's best to allow the world to do the world's job, which will be judging you. And you to do your job, which is to write whatever the fuck you want to write. You've got to write your journal, write your journal. You've got no other task. If you've got to write your paper, write your paper. If you're going to be booty, okay. But your job is just to finish the damn thing. And I often think we get caught up in these categorical confusions about where we're at. And so my question is, you ain't the judge. So why are you worried? I know why we're worried. Because we grow up in a climate where the judgment of others has determined our destiny. You know, you grow up in a place where judgment of others determines your destiny if you become fucking powerless. But jocks are useful for this as well. You know? A lot of jocks are playing in moments where something they do will determine the fate of sometimes a year of the school. Well, you know, it's not really up to you the way that things play out. You gotta take your shot. Finish, what can you do? First things first is you gotta like, I mean, I would argue if I was a student, especially if you are exhibiting these tendencies of like, you know, inhibition because of this sort of punitive culture. Guys, I don't understand why these schools permit students to come in as first-year students without a practice of compassion.
Right.
Because, guys, you are gonna experience setbacks as a student or as an adult. The question isn't, am I gonna fail or not? The question is your question. What do I do when I receive a setback? Well, guys, there's a couple of approaches, right? But the least productive approach is to get mad at yourself. The least productive approach is to put the whip down. You know, if I fail and I want to get something out of this, probably the best thing to do is to be compassionate to yourself. You can't kick yourself. You did the best you can at that given moment. Were you lazy? No, probably you were a little lazy. Did you catch a bad grade? Probably you caught a bad grade. Was other shit happening in your life? Probably other shit was happening in your life. But I just don't think you can get anywhere from the fail if there's not compassion. Because usually if we fail and then we light into ourselves, we basically double down on the problem. You know, again, I would argue that if you take a shot and you don't sink it, if you sit under the basket and cry. But it took me a long time to figure out how to be nice to myself because you don't get into places like Georgia Tech because you are compassionate. If you get into Georgia Tech, you got here because you drove yourself beyond the limits of the imagination. Because when you were tired, you were like, I'm not going to be tired. When everybody else was chilling and hanging out, you were like, I'm going to crack the books. You know, most of you got into Georgia Tech because you're good at the whip. The whip can get you into a place, but you can't stay in a place with the whip. Eventually, you're going to break you